Devin Graves, once again coming to you from Studio D, this time with a follow-up video from my last video called Why I Use Pro Tools and Why Maybe You Shouldn't. The way I left off on that video seemed as if I was unhappy that I couldn't upgrade my major Pro Tools rig that I have in here. And that's actually not the case. I actually want to make this new video called Why I'm Glad That I Can't Upgrade My Pro Tools Rig. This video was actually spawned by a comment from someone called Del Mix Edit. Check out his channel. This is not a diss on him at all. He does a really good channel. I looked over at him and subscribed myself. But what he said is that this is the nature of the beast, that technology moves forward and basically it should be expected that things are going to be obsolete. And in the computer world, for sure, that's the case because computers are getting better and better and better, and it makes sense that things move forward. Where I really had the problem was with that they're not supporting these big consoles. So far, they're still supporting the C24 console, and I really love the console. And of course, the new consoles they have are awesome. It's really awesome. So if somebody's coming into the game, starting, get a Yukon-based console. You can use it for anything, including Pro Tools. But I'm kind of talking about us guys that came into Pro Tools where Pro Tools was really the only, let's say, muscle car of pro audio. And so a lot of investments were made both in these high-end consoles. As I mentioned, this one called there's a Pro Control, that's an older model, also now obsolete past Pro Tools 10. The D Command and the D Control are these major consoles that were the upgrade from the Pro Control. And as I mentioned in the past video, those things go upwards of $100,000 if you have them fully expanded. And my gripe was that they don't seem to be continuing support on those consoles. I guess what I was really getting at was that ever since Pro Tools 9, when they opened up their system to all the audio interfaces out there, and also any of the control surfaces out there, they seem to only be turning their back on the DigiDesign stuff, which is the original company that created Pro Tools. It was a small company that got big, and then Avid bought them out. Avid was actually a film company. They were known for this offline film editing system that was used in major Hollywood productions, and that was pretty much the way you edited your movies back in the day of film. And it kind of made sense that they took DigiDesign and made it really integrated with their Avid systems. And that was also really in line with the really high-end pro industry, the major motion picture industry and the major label. But some of us people that aren't quite at that level, but we're fortunate enough to make some major investments in a Pro Tools rig, we just find ourselves cut off from being able to upgrade further into the system. And as Del Mix Edit says, well, that's just what we should expect. He mentioned something about how cars become obsolete and other things of that nature. And of course, we all know this. This is something called planned obsolescence. And this is what big businesses embed into their manufacturing so that people will need a new car in 5 years, that people will need a new computer. Well, people will probably want a new computer as it gets more and more capable. As I said in my last video, the M1 MacBook is now powerful enough to pretty much not need any of the DSP cards and stuff that I have for my major Pro Tools system. This is why I'm glad I can't upgrade. Again, some context. As I'd mentioned before in the last video, I began in the analog world. I had an analog home recording studio, which was comprised of a Mackie 8-bus 32-channel mixing board, a couple of decent effect processors, a couple outboard compressors, and a Tascam MSR16 half-inch reel-to-reel 16-track. Now, I made this investment just before they came out with ADATs, for better or for worse, but I really loved the analog deck. Now, 1990s me was rocking that system. And if I would have looked into the future and seen what I have now, what is now obsolete, this would have been beyond my wildest dreams. I have now digital recording, complete automated mixing, basically unlimited track count. I have virtual instruments that far surpass the modules that I had paid a lot of money for. And now I can put compressors and equalizers on every channel. And if I would have imagined the rig that I have now, well, it didn't even exist then. I mean, not only did I have my home studio that was analog, but every record that Psychotic Waltz had done, from A Social Grace through Bleeding, was all done on complete analog systems. Analog mixing boards, analog 2-inch 24-track tape. So the 24-track system and a mixing board that can accommodate 24 tracks, maybe more, that was the gold standard, and that was what anybody would have aspired to. So now fast forward to where I am now, complete digital automation. I have a rock-solid DSP-based system that affords me complete ability to open up as many plugins as I need, as many EQs, compressors, reverbs, delays, whatever, and it's all a very solid, stable unit. And the power of the computer, which the computer I have is actually a Mac Pro Tower. It's got 32 gigs of memory. It's got, I don't know, a 4-core or an 8-core. I don't even know what processor it has, because it actually doesn't matter. All of the processing is done on the DSP cards. I never run out of computer power. And even if I did max out my DSP cards, I could then overflow them into the computer for processing natively in the computer. So I just have no need for anything. And I always believed that operating system upgrades or Pro Tools or Logic or whatever upgrades, that following those upgrades is something you should take real caution in doing, because it can give with one hand and it can take with the other. If you upgrade your operating system, make sure you have to upgrade it. If you upgrade your recording software, make sure you have to. What I mean by that is that there's a functionality in the new version that you need that you do not have. When I upgraded to Pro Tools, I felt I needed it because I wanted that real-time ability to monitor the real-time use of the effect plugins. And what I was trying to do is have my system emulate as closely as possible to what I had with the analog domain, namely the mixing console. You know, the one thing about going into digital what I loved about it was the sound. I do think the sound was better. There's no question about it. I do think that the facilities were much more complete. In the analog world, if I wanted a compressor on every channel, I had to buy a compressor for every channel. In the digital world, you just buy one plug-in, and as long as your computer can handle the workload or your DSP can handle the workload, boom, go to town. But what I didn't like about it was that I was no longer mixing at a console. I was sitting there with a computer screen and a mouse. And everything that I had ever associated with audio recording, the mixing console, the tape recorder, the effect processors, all that tactile, physical stuff, was what made me want to be in the studio. I wanted to sit at that desk. I wanted to turn those knobs. I wanted to do a mix and have my hands on it. And when I went into digital, when I went into Logic, although I was happy with the sound, I wasn't happy with the process. In fact, it felt more like a chore to go in and go to work, especially when it come to mixing. I kind of dreaded mixing. I wasn't enjoying the process. I really didn't know why. At first, I thought it was because, okay, now this is my job. And so when it was my hobby, I loved it. But now that it's my job, I resent it or something. I was thinking that was the mentality behind it. It wasn't that I get to go into the studio. It was that I have to go into the studio. The first thing I did was I got this 8-channel controller called Mackie It was made by Mackie. It was called a Mackie Logic Control. And that had motorized faders, 8 of them, and some pan pots, and then some buttons, for functions. And that helped a lot. It certainly got me into automating the mix, and that I first started using when I was recording and mixing A Murder of Crows. So that was a good step up, but I was working 24 tracks then. And when I first learned of the Logic Motu system, it was actually represented to me as a 24-track system. I was told that I couldn't go beyond 24 tracks. And for me at the time, that was exactly all I had known anyway, so that was a perfect luxury for me. It turned out that you could get more tracks out of it, and by the time I did the January tree, I had unlocked that mystery. Now, fast forwarding to when I got the Pro Tools rig, I was super happy with it, and I was doing the Shadow Theory record. And then I was using a lot more tracks, especially on certain songs like the Symphony of Shadows, where there was a lot of orchestration and there was just a ton of instruments. I was using, I don't know, that has maybe 70 tracks on it or something. So scrolling around with a little 8-channel console, it can bank in channels of 8, but, to get to track 72, you're pushing that scroll button a lot and you have a very narrow window. And then I became aware of this console here, the C24, and that seemed like, oh my God, that seems like the thing I really want. And it was very expensive. This thing cost about $10,000, even up to $13,000 depending on where you got it. Fortunately, Psychotic Waltz did this Power of Metal tour, and that's where I got the money to buy this console. And once I got this console, and let me show you this thing. This thing has 24 channels that's completely scrollable. There's a lot about it. I'd like to do a complete rundown on why this console is so awesome. But basically, on every channel, you can call up the EQ on that channel, and the parameters spill right across this scribble strip here. And so you're just using the knobs, similar to how you would do on a analog console, instead of using a mouse where you're kind of using your eyes to judge your sound. With this, you can close your eyes and turn the knob, and you can mix a lot more like the analog way. The automation functionality is amazing. This is just a beautiful console, and it's basically, once I had this, my love for mixing, my love for recording returned. Why I wasn't enjoying the process wasn't because it had become my job. It was because I lost touch of everything I had associated with the art of recording, and that basically revolves around the console. And this console is actually more enjoyable than the analog console that I still have sitting over there. Then the next step was upgrading the 2 cards that I originally had, the 2 TDM processing cards for Pro Tools. Well, they became obsolete, actually. And this is why I'm happy they became obsolete. I touched on this before, but these cards that cost upwards of $5,000 for one card, and now that they became obsolete, people started selling them cheap. And so I bought a expansion chassis, a Magma expansion chassis, that those things used to be a couple of $1,000s. I got one for about $400, and that has 6 open slots. And I was buying Pro Tools Axel cards for a little over $100 a pop. So for about $1,000, I put in what would have been about a $30,000 investment. Thank you, Avid, for making the TDM platform obsolete. Just because it's obsolete doesn't mean it doesn't work amazing. And so now I have this closed system. I had been running Pro Tools 7 ever since I bought it. And when I got it, it was the new version. That was the current version. And then Pro Tools 8 came out, which I couldn't upgrade to because I had an old Mac Power PC, and you needed an Intel Mac to run Pro Tools 8. So I just stuck with the Pro Tools 7 for the whole time, for all the time I did. Even the last thing I did on Pro Tools 7 was Eric Clayton's 1,000 Scars. Finally, during that production, the end of that production, my computer blue screened on me. and it was a major crash. So I actually got the system working again. I did a marathon mix to finish his revision notes. We had already been basically done with the mix, but we had some revisions to do. I was scared to death to turn the computer off once I got it running, so I did all the revisions in one marathon session. And then I ordered this Mac Pro with the Intel processors. Then I couldn't any longer use Pro Tools 7, so I had to upgrade to Pro Tools 8. My intention was to actually upgrade to Pro Tools 10 because I actually wanted that version. There were some pretty enticing features in there, but it was still too expensive. Even though it was outdated, it was still too expensive. So I found a version of Pro Tools 9 that also included a version of Pro Tools 8, and I installed Pro Tools 9, and it no longer saw this console. I actually knew that was an issue when they first put out Pro Tools 9. They forgot to make it compatible with the C24, and then they had to make an upgrade. It was a free upgrade to their credit, which made the C24 work. But also I noticed that there were some plugins that I was using with PT7 that kind of disappeared. Just some real basic ones like the LA3A and some other ones that I used all the time that were no longer available in Pro Tools 9. So I reverted to Pro Tools 8, and all those plugins were back, including some new ones. So the upgrade from Pro Tools 7 to Pro Tools 8 was really worthwhile. I like Pro Tools 8 quite a bit more. As I had mentioned in the previous video, it is much more stable than even Pro Tools 7. And from what I understand, it's much more stable than Pro Tools 10. And Glenn Fricker even did a video where he was recording in a studio that was running Pro Tools, and he was really frustrated because that rig kept crashing. And that was a current version of Pro Tools. He said it just kept crashing. So I'm just going to stick with Pro Tools 8. And now I've got this system. I cannot upgrade, but it is massive. It's massive. It has everything I could ever need. And it works. It works day in, it works day out. It's a system far beyond my expectations of what I would ever be using back when I was in the 90s. And if it's more than I ever had during that whole Psychotic Waltz era, even in the big studios, much more. If it's so much more than the Beatles had when they were using 4 tracks or 8 tracks, if it's so much more than that, it's enough. I mean, if you upgrade to Pro Tools Ultimate now, you can get 1,000 tracks, over 1,000 tracks. And if you're in the motion picture industry, if you're doing the new Avatar movie with all the Foley and the scoring and the ADR, the automatic dialogue replacement, maybe it makes sense to do that. But if you're recording audio, hell, A Murder of Crows was the most successful record I've ever done on my own. That was a 24-track project. Even when I opened up more tracks, on the January Tree and Lullaby for the Devil and The Dead Word, was my record more successful as a result of that? Nope. It doesn't come down to the processing power of your computer or the kind of plugins you have anymore. I use a very basic tool set. I use multi-track recording, EQ, compression, reverb, delay, chorus, and those related old-fashioned effects. Tape saturation, yes, maybe. Some distortion, some overdrive, yes, maybe. And that's about it. Melodyne, autotune, no thank you. I'll just sit here and sing it right. I'll sing it until I get it right. I sing off pitch, and I hear that it's off pitch, and I sing it again until it's on pitch. It was good enough for Led Zeppelin. It's good enough for me. So I'm a pretty old school guy. And so the beauty of it is I can just put upgrading out of my mind. completely out of my mind. And where does my money go now? Instead of chasing my tail, getting the new version of Pro Tools, getting a new this or a new that, new interfaces, no. Now my money goes towards hardware. It goes towards instruments, guitars, microphones, outboard preamps. My money goes to Neve and Blackline Audio and Warm Audio and API and Neumann, somewhere where these investments are going to make a difference. They're going to make a difference in my recordings. They're going to allow me to do more. And if you think about it, the better and better and better UAD or Avid gets at making plugins, most of what they're doing is emulating this classic old hardware. Apparently, they get better and better and better at doing it. At what day is their 1176 going to be better than a real one? If that's what they're emulating, I'd just rather have the real thing. I record with it, and if I need it again in the mix, I send the recording out to it and print it down. And the old plugins, the old Bomb Factory 1176 and LA2As that I use all the time, they're great. I record in with the classic stuff, and then I use lightly these plugins to mix. So what more do I need? I'd rather buy a new guitar. I'd rather buy a set of congas if I need congas. I'd rather buy, if I can't buy new plugins, new samples, I would rather buy the instrument anyway. Real congas, real bongos, real percussion. As much real as I can get, I'll invest my money in that. And those things are never, ever going to be obsolete. It's true that the computer world thinks it is planned obsolescence. It's true in the world of automobiles, there is planned obsolescence. But in the world of pro audio, especially the analog world, that stuff that was created in the 1940s is still the best stuff available today. Those microphones in the 40s, 50s, and 60s are unsurpassed. The preamps and the compressors of the same eras, unsurpassed. They're still the gold standard to which plugins or new equipment is measured. So I invest in those things, precious few of them, and I'm good to go. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, my microphones are still going to be a worthwhile investment. My preamps, my compressors, my outboard gear, my guitars are still going to be a worthwhile investment. As long as my system remains up and running, my Pro Tools investment is a worthwhile investment. I'm just a firm believer in owning what you have, keeping your computer offline where it comes to serious work, only upgrading if there's functionality that you must have, and instead putting your money into real physical gear that you do own that isn't going to go obsolete, like microphones, like instruments, like outboard gear, analog outboard gear. But more important than that, put your mind on the music. It doesn't matter how fancy the plugins are. It doesn't matter how many tracks you can get. What matters is the music. What matters is your ideas. That is what is going to make or break the success of your band, of your music, of your recordings. It's going to be the content and the performance. The songwriting and the performance. That's where your mind needs to go. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.